So let's turn our attention now to Odyssey. So Odyssey is set during the early stages of the Peloponnesian War. Its main character is either Cassandra or Alexios, depending on whether you want the female or the male option. And they are a Spartan exile whose family were the targets of a group called the Cult of Cosmos. And the cult is similar to the Order of Ancients, just from a few hundred years earlier. Now, much more so than with Origins, Odyssey engages with the long-running story of the Assassin's Creed franchise. This has to do with Isu. This is the Precursor Civilization that leaves behind these powerful artifacts that has shaped human history. Now, in the case of Odyssey, the protagonist is actually descended from them, and so winds up being depicted as something of a demigod amongst ordinary Greeks. Now, the idea of a precursor civilization is very long-standing. For instance, the Isu here are depicted as the people of Atlantis, just to give you some sense of how the game interweaves this pseudo-historical storyline with myth. They're quite clever about it at times. For instance, the game depicts the prophecies of the Oracle at Delphi as the work of an Isu artifact that can see the future. And it's the Cult of Cosmos that has the artifact, and it uses these prophecies to shape Greek politics in the direction that it wants them to go. I mean, really, the Oracle at Delphi shaped Greek politics, just simply probably didn't have an artifact that allowed them to actually see the future, we hope. But it fits very nicely, really. Now, what I'd actually like to talk about here is the game's willingness to allow the player to de-romanticize both Athens and Sparta. It kind of seems inevitable that the player will wind up comparing and contrasting the two sides, especially when the player character has no true allegiance to either. Safe to say that many players are going to come into this game with a certain amount of cultural baggage on the subject. So, for example, Athens, under Pericles, is seen as a sort of golden age. It's the crucible of democracy, despite the fact that, it's got fairly stringent requirements for citizenship, and resident foreigners, women, and slaves don't really have much access to political life. The golden age of Athens is a cornerstone of popular history, and unfortunately is also a major ingredient in alt-right thinking. Now, Sparta is equally romanticized by modern culture in a different way, and arguably a much more dangerous way. So Sarah Bond points out that this flawed popular image of Sparta as, the home of the greatest soldiers in history, willing to lay down their lives for their nation, fearsomely devoted to the ruthless rules of their society. This is something that has inspired a variety of different groups, everything from defenders of the Second Amendment in the United States to members of the alt-right. And the phrase, Molon Labe, come and get them, from the story of Thermopylae, is used, for instance, as a motto by defenders of the Second Amendment in the States. I'm not going to call them gun nuts because that would be rude. Now, Sarah Bond is actually particularly worried about the affection for Sparta being used to justify eugenics. She says, looking at Sparta as it actually was is the best way to encourage critical thinking about our past and how it's used in the modern day. And the Spartan myth is used, as I said, in the modern day. It's not just the Second Amendment folk. It's, Golden Dawn in Greece. For heaven's sakes, it's even Steve Bannon in North America. So what Odyssey does, which I think is great, is it gives players the chance to reevaluate both of these city-states through the mechanism of the protagonist. Now, the game doesn't require you to do this. I'm going to use Cassandra as the default protagonist here rather than saying Cassandra or Alexios every time. Honestly, she's the much better protagonist anyways. You can choose to play Cassandra as a born-again Spartan who throws herself into earning the right to return to her homeland and live under its laws. You can also play her as an outsider who's spellbound by Athens and some of the remarkable people she meets there. But neither is a natural fit, because the game definitely encourages her to regard both cities with a degree of skepticism. I mean, Cassandra is distinctly an outsider in Athens, and she finds herself frustrated more than once by the twists and turns of its politics. The tragedy that drives her from Sparta can, if the player chooses, survive in resentment directed at her homeland and its leaders. Now, the game doesn't necessarily do a really great job of supporting this level of interaction with the game world. So, for instance, if you manage to move a city from Athenian to Spartan control, the only real difference is the banners are a different color. Guards will still attack you if you enter a restricted zone, even if you've just helped them take over the city. But it's actually in the role-playing elements of the game, and specifically in Cassandra's interactions with NPCs, where you actually have the opportunity to either embrace or reject the stereotypical views of Athens and Sparta. So, for instance, in Athens, she meets Pericles, and she does so because she's encouraged by Herodotus to seek out his help in finding her mother. Now, despite Herodotus vouching for her, she's not granted immediate access to Pericles' social circle. She first has to prove herself by carrying out a set of tasks on his behalf to make sure that he can invite her without needing to justify showing such favor to a foreigner. And to be fair, he's already under great pressure. Cassandra first meets him when he's just lost a public debate with his rival Cleon. So the Pericles that she meets is not, an idealized portrayal of the man at the height of his power. He's tired, he's worried, he's struggling to maintain his position. His city is under siege by the Spartans. He's trying to figure out how to deal with it. The tasks that he assigns to her are not straightforward and can actually be quite underhanded. So, for instance, she's asked to rig an ostracism vote so that a friend of Pericles will actually lose and thus have an excuse to leave the city. Now, even when she does get to speak to Pericles personally, he doesn't take her warnings about the cult's threat seriously. He doesn't even take Herodotus's warnings seriously. He simply wishes her well, and this is going to lead to his death in the end. Now, Cassandra is equally unimpressed with many of the other guests at the symposium, especially with those who take her questions about her mother as an excuse to open a philosophical discussion. We see her walking away from a conversation with Protagoras, calling it useless. And when she finally leaves the symposium, she says she's, quote, had enough of Athenian hospitality to last me a lifetime. Now, she has much more negative interactions even with Cleon. Later in the story, she returns to Athens during a plague, and she finds Cleon whipping up a mob outside Pericles' residence. And he's shouting to the crowd. He is claiming that he is the only one who can restore Athens to greatness and that the city deserves to be feared again. And I'm thinking that this particular piece of dialogue on his part was almost certainly composed with Trump in mind. Because seriously, he does everything but shout, "Make Athens great again." It's enough to make your skin crawl. Now, later in the story, Cassandra is captured fighting alongside the Spartans at Pylos, and she finds herself a prisoner in Athens. Cleon, at that point, is revealed as a leading member of the cult. Not a surprise, really. And he comes to gloat at her cell door. She finds out that he has stirred up Athens to allow him to attack the city of Mytilene under false pretenses. And actually, depending on whether or not Cassandra fulfills some contracts offered to her by Cleon much earlier in the story, she may actually have unintentionally helped him do that. Now, Cleon is almost gleefully cynical about how he's using the tools of Athenian democracy to consolidate his own power. And he has a really great bit of dialogue. He says, "The act itself is out of my hands. The vote has been cast. What did I tell you? The people have given me their blessing. I use their power. The people of Athens have spoken without me lifting a finger." Now, this is not a flattering picture of Athenian democracy. Cassandra doesn't give very much direct commentary on it. Her priority, of course, is to get out of the cell. When you look at it, the combination of Cleon's manipulative actions and Pericles' failure to stop him really does point out the flaws in the system. Athens may be the forerunner of modern democracy, but that doesn't mean its people always make the best choices. Now, Cassandra is eventually able to help discredit Cleon by finding and helping Socrates make public Cleon's plan to continue manipulating the vote to target more cities. They do so via a public debate on the responsibility of a leader, to be honest with his people. It's basically a performance. So they gather a crowd, they lead the debate in a particular way, they stir up people to be angry at Cleon for lying to them. Now, the fact that they have to go to such lengths to use these popular tools of Athenian democracy to defend Athenian democracy really emphasizes the limitations of the Athenian system. It is not the glorious ancestor of democracy. It's imperfect. It's messy. Whatever its historical legacy, it is not something to be unthinkingly idealized. Now, obviously, Sparta is Cassandra's home, so the game is going to provide the player with even more opportunity to react to Spartans and their customs. So the circumstances surrounding Cassandra's exile from Sparta were very tragic ones. As a child, she tried to intervene when one of the elders tried to throw her baby brother Alexius off Mount Taygetos, and this was in accordance with a prophecy from the Pythia that he would doom Sparta. This is the work of the cult. They were trying to attack her family. So as she tries to save her brother, she accidentally knocks the elder off the cliff as well. Her stepfather, Nikolaos, has to redeem his family honor by picking her up and throwing her off the cliff, which he does. So Cassandra's major decisions in the game relate to how she reacts when she's faced with various members of her family after so many years. And really, it's only natural and realistic for her to question her feelings about her homeland. But even so, the player is not forced, despite her position as an exile, to take a cynical view of Sparta. They are free to have her embrace her Spartan roots and to fight specifically to earn her place among them once more. Basically, to play out the myth. Now, I'm going to argue that the game actually nudges the player towards a more critical approach, but it doesn't railroad them. And I think the reason that this option even exists, this more shallow option, is that the Spartan myth is so deeply rooted in the popular imagination. If you try to steer the player too overtly away from it, it's not going to be received well. And I think almost we can argue that Ubisoft recognized they weren't going to reach everyone with this storyline about the flaws of Sparta. Is it cynical that they still left in the options that are going to appeal to those who do not think critically about history? Possibly, but it's a game. They're trying to sell it. They need to make money. They want to maximize their audience. There are some interesting choices being made here. And suffice to say, I'm going to be really interested to see what they do with the Vikings in another couple months. Now, the chances for Cassandra to second-guess her re-engagement with her Spartan roots are plentiful. Almost immediately upon returning home to Sparta with her mother, Myrine, Cassandra is presented with an example of how fundamentally cruel her home society can be. She and Myrine encounter a pair of young boys struggling to fend off a pack of wolves, and Cassandra quite naturally can express a desire to help them. But Myrine will tell her, don't interfere, this is the agoge. It's the Spartan method of training young boys to become soldiers. She can follow her mother's advice and ride away, or she can intervene, and it's messy. If she intervenes, she doesn't successfully save both the boys, and we'll have an argument with Spartan soldiers who show up. Now, as she and her mother leave, if she chose the option to intervene, Myrine will point out that this isn't another part of Greece. This is Sparta, and if you break Spartan law, you're going to be killed. And Cassandra rather sarcastically retorts with, believe me, Mater, I know exactly what breaking Spartan law gets you. And she continues to make skeptical comments, including about the role of the Helots in Spartan society. Myrine tells her that some people are, in fact, happy to sacrifice independence for comfort. Cassandra expresses her doubts that the Helots really see it that way. And interestingly, this is not an optional part of dialogue in this case. The player hears it one way or the other. So I think what was going on here is that the game will allow you to maintain the Spartan myth to a degree, but they're not going to go on record as approving of the Helot system. Now, Cassandra is told by the kings of Sparta that in order to prove herself and to win back her family's property for her mother, she has to perform a number of very difficult tasks. And these are even worse than the tasks that she performs in order to get to talk to them in the first place. She's very dubious about this, and at one point she can even choose to talk back to the kings in a decidedly non-diplomatic way. And there's one particular part of the conversation which is interesting. The player can choose, when the king asks her, "Why are you here?" You can choose to have her stay focused on her quest to hunt the cult. And that allows her to express her doubts and anger at Sparta. Or she can choose to reintegrate into Spartan society and help Marini regain their family's property. Now, you wind up doing the same stuff either way. You're still going off to hunt cultists, but it makes a difference on the role-playing level. And what's interesting is that you're actually better received by the kings if you say, "I'm here to kill cultists." If you say, "I'm here to become Spartan again," they doubt that you can be. They point out that you're being presumptuous. This hostility is implicit in the conversation. But really, in the end, you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. You can even get Mom her house back without embracing the system that nearly killed you. You are given the opportunity to publicly acknowledge its flaws. And what I found really interesting is that the same is true of some of the NPCs. King Pausanias, for instance, tells Cassandra, when he's asking her to help him remove 3 officers who've been mistreating the Helots to the point where he's worried about a revolt, he says that, quote, "When Spartans aren't killing, they're training to kill, and when they're not killing Athenians, they're declaring war on their own people." He has doubts about Sparta. And of course, this is all very ironic, given how Pausanias ends up. I won't spoil you on that. Now, in this part of the game, Cassandra, her mother, and a Spartan ally, Brasidas, meet in Arcadia to investigate rumors of another cultist. And she meets them there. She's been off doing other things for the kings. And by the time she gets there, she discovers that the two of them have in fact established that it's the Archon of Arcadia who is the cultist. And the Archon, Lagos, is an old friend of Brasidas. It's a complex issue because it's not just the personal side of it. Arcadia is Sparta's main supply of grain. So when Marini tells Cassandra we have to murder this man because he's a cultist, and Brasidas says, "No, we don't, because A, he's my friend, and B, we don't want our people to starve," it's tricky, and Cassandra has to pick one route or the other. Now, if you choose to reason with the Archon, the only way it will work is if you made the right choice in an earlier part of the story. So much earlier in the storyline, Cassandra is in Corinth, dealing with another cultist, the Monger. And she is given the choice at that point. Does she kill him, in the middle of town, basically, where everybody can see her get rid of this horrible, horrible man? This is the request of the woman that she's working with. Or does she kill him in a private place and simply have him disappear? And that was actually Brasidas' request, because he did not want to see unrest in Corinth if the person who controlled its underworld was publicly murdered. So if you killed him in private instead of doing it for all of Corinth to see, the Archon will actually listen to reason. He will give you the evidence that you need to expose one of the Spartan kings as a cultist. If, however, you killed him in the middle of town and everybody knows you're a cultist slaughtering maniac, even if you save this man's family, and that's the interesting thing, he's not actually a willing member of the cult. He dabbled in it, but then they took his family hostage in order to make sure he did what they asked him to. And even if you've saved his family, if you killed this other cultist in public, he will not believe you. He will assume that you're just going to wait and murder him when he lets his guard down. So basically, Cassandra only gets the best resolution here if she has chosen, throughout the story, not to be the stereotypical Spartan who solves all her problems with the spear. She can save the Archon's family, she can protect the grain supply for the ordinary people of Sparta, and she can unmask a traitor who's a very high-ranking member of the cult, who is warping Sparta by his presence. And she can do all of this by using her words. So, in general, she doesn't need to embrace her former identity in order to do anything. She doesn't have to do it to win her mother back her home. She certainly doesn't have to do it to reunite her family. Sparta is not at any point depicted by the game as either an ideal society or a society that should be idealized. It's deeply flawed. Now again, it's worth repeating that the game allows for a range of responses by Cassandra to what she encounters in Athens and in Sparta. It does, however, give the player small yet noticeable nudges to remind them to think critically about what they're seeing, and ideally to reevaluate some of their long-held stereotypes about these two city-states. Now, the game's version of both societies contain highly admirable individuals. They often struggle just as much as Cassandra does with the limitations of their society. Brasidas, in particular, on the Spartan side, is great. But it's up to the player to decide how their version of Cassandra is going to navigate between the opposing sides. How much is her past going to inform her decisions? What is she going to learn from her friends and her enemies as she moves forward? I mean, this is one of the reasons I do quite like these games. I'm not fond of the fact that they allow for the more shallow interpretation of history. I would have loved to have seen Odyssey commit to deromanticizing Sparta thoroughly, but even the provision of the option to do so is an improvement. They are really trying to encourage their players to practice more complex historical thinking, and I think that's really admirable. I mean, in general, the more thought and research that goes into games like this, the less likely that they can be easily misappropriated by those who prefer to turn political history to political ends. So I hope you've enjoyed this. If you're a gamer and you haven't tried these, I actually highly recommend both. All right, thanks very much.